Well, good evening, everyone. So glad to be with you tonight. I want to thank you so much for the invitation to come up and speak to you tonight. And I hope that, if nothing else, I can leave you with something to think about. I've talked with Byron several times on Facebook, and we were just discussing beforehand how sometimes awkward it is to meet someone in person after you've only known them online. But it turns out we lived within a mile of each other for nearly 10 years and didn't even know it when we both lived in the Atlanta area. And it's so funny that that's just how the church works. It's either a big family or it's a small world, one of the two, and it has to be one of them. And it's really enjoyable that we get that in Christian fellowship, and I appreciate very much the song that espouses that very sentiment. Talking about growing into Christ and the topic that I've been giving about sowing decency, at first I wasn't sure exactly how to approach this. Because understanding that decency is merely just adhering to a code of conduct or a set morality of such. I think we all understand that Christianity comes with an inherent morality. There's an expectation of our behavior and the way that we conduct ourselves, and that it should be in decency. That our conduct should say something about what it is that we profess and that we believe. And too often what happens is that when we go out trying to sow decency, we're trying to get others on board with the way of our thinking and the way of our living. And what happens a lot of times is that we forget the influence and then the basis of the approach that it has. I think a lot of times we mistake the gospel of Christ with the morality of Christianity, and those two things are not the same. The good news is that I don't have to die and go to hell for bad behavior. But that's not decency. Decency is how we respond once we realize that message. And so often we become frustrated. It's like beating our head against a wall because we want people to understand what it is that we have, and we want to share with them what it is that we've come to know. But the way that we approach that too often is backwards. We want to go and we want to preach morality to a lost world that doesn't care. And what we first have to do is preach to them Christ. We first have to give them a reason to change what they believe. You see, why we believe what we believe will always be more important than what we do. Don't get me wrong. Morality and decency is all very important, but if we are trying to sow decency to a world that has lost a grasp of what that really means, we're never going to reach them if we just go and preach morality. We like to take teachings like 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The famous teaching that we all know where Paul goes and he says, and such were some of you, after he lists all the things that will keep one out of heaven. And we take that and we believe that telling the world that is going to convert them to Christ, but all it's doing is pushing them away. We haven't changed their why. And until you change their why, what they do will never follow. And so it got me thinking about, well, how do we sow decency then? How do we get people to see this? How do we get them to understand what we understand? Because I can tell you, I wasn't always a Christian. I didn't grow up in the church. As a matter of fact, I didn't become a Christian until I was 28 years old. And prior to that, and this was another lesson for another time, but I had grown up an atheist. And by the time I was 28 years old, I was a $200 a day drug addict. And so I couldn't care less about what was decent and good. I was so focused on myself and the lifestyle that goes with all things addict. It wasn't until someone changed my why that my what followed. And so when Byron asked me to talk about sowing decency, I had to think back into my mind, well, what was it that reached me? How was it that Brownlee Reeves from the Mountain View congregation in Cumming, Georgia, was able to reach me? And here's the truth, it wasn't just Brownlee. It was the whole congregation. I could go down about a list of 5 evangelists that aren't even evangelists. They were just people there that loved me. They were willing to bear with all of my garbage and all the junk that I brought with me. It's like they were able to see right through me, right past me to what I could be, rather than who I was in the moment. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget walking into the Mountain View Church that first night, being so apprehensive, just knowing that I'm not going to fit in here. Going in knowing that I'm going to be judged for the way that I look. These people aren't going to understand what I'm going through. And the truth is I couldn't have been more happy to be wrong about that. It's so funny. I was worried about people being judgmental, and here I was being the judgmental one. Those people didn't care what I looked like. And you have to understand, if you think my hair is crazy now, it was definitely crazy then. See, I still am who I am, but a little different. But the truth was, I came in there with both of my ears pierced, my nose was pierced, my eyebrow was pierced. I've got tattoos. I had jet black hair. I was about 100 pounds skinnier because I was an addict. It's funny what happens when you start eating again. The thing is all of that didn't matter. None of it. All that baggage that I'm bringing with me, they could care less about that. They just wanted me to know that I was loved. And I had never felt that. And so that's what got me thinking about how it is that we sow decency. It has to go back and originate with the originator. It has to create with the creator. And the way that we do that is this. Author Tom Bodett, quoting Immanuel Kant, said this about contentment. This will make sense in a minute. He said, for a man to be truly happy, he needs something to do, he needs something to look forward to, and he needs someone to love. Those three things. Something to do, something to look forward to, and someone to love. And while I am in complete agreement with this concept, I also realize that's not new. This is a biblical principle hidden in plain sight because as far as I know, Tom Bodett's not a believer. But for true contentment in life, something that most of the world who engages in what we would call immoral behavior, that's what they're searching for. The world around us is trying to find happiness in the things that the world has to offer. Drinking, drugs, sex, pornography. You name it. I mean, there's a list, right? That's where the world's trying to find their contentment. They don't know what we know. And what Mr. Bodett says here is that they need something to do with their time. They need something to look forward to in their hearts, and they need someone to love to help keep them grounded and accountable. This is true contentment in life, and the Bible prescribes the exact same thing. The Bible prescribes the exact same thing. You see, something to do is faith. And something to look forward to is hope. And someone to love, well, that's love. That's self-explanatory. And love, as 1 Corinthians chapter 13 tells us, is the absolute truth. And it is also the greatest of these three. The greatest because it is of God, it is from God, and 1 John 4:7 says it is God himself. And I'll suggest to you that those aren't the only reason that it's the greatest. There's a multitude of reasons why it's the greatest, but we're going to focus on those three tonight because there's an aspect of it, in addition to that I want us to see that love is also the greatest motivator of all. Again, we have to get the world to change its why if we want their what to follow. You with me? You want people to change what they're doing, you got to change why they're doing it. You have to change their internal motivation. You have to change that internal dialogue in their head and the reasons why they're searching for contentment in a world that they're never going to find it. It's like eating junk food. It's a lot of fun. And it tastes really good in the moment, but in an hour you're going to be hungry again. That's what the world has to offer. And so tonight, in talking about sowing decency, it's going to be a lesson about faith, hope, and love because it's those three things that gives a man or a woman purpose. It's those three things that changes why they do what they do so that what they do will follow. It's the mode of function of which all fruit is born, and the fruit of the Spirit is powered. When we are bearing the fruit of the Spirit, it is by and large the power source for this good work. And in this theme of lessons and growing into Christ, I want to be discussing with you this concept of sowing decency as part of sowing spiritual seeds. And so to help us better understand the life and the nature of Christian living, and that sowing decency is then so much more than a moral code or a behavior pattern. It is much more than the presence of good works and the absence of bad behavior. It is how the Christian is able to share the gospel with their life as opposed to with words only. Any of us can be really good at talking the talk. But what the world watches is the walk. Does the walk follow the talk? And that's especially true online. Whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Twitter or whatever social media you subscribe to, if you even do. It's funny how brave we get behind the keyboard. It's funny the things that we'll say when someone can't actually reach out and grab us. But what's sad about that? What's really sad about that is it's the things that we'll say thinking that we've won something. We think, oh, I got them this time. They can't come back to that, but all we've done is tune them out. And they're never going to hear what it is that we have to say. And I don't know about you, but that's a loss in my book. We're not trying to win arguments. We're trying to win people. We're trying to win souls. And being right is far less important than being loving. The quote that we started with, as it states, is how we sow decency. We help people find their purpose truly motivated by the love of God. Sowing decency is what it means whenever we say that we might be the only Bible that some people ever get to read. You've heard that, right? You've heard that stated, that we might be the only Bible some people ever get to read. So shouldn't we be worth reading then? That our words follow our actions and vice versa? And here's what is important about that. When you look around the world, our country, the state, your town, the number of people that just seem to be discontent is more than ever it has been. And it's baffling to me. If you've ever known anyone that has done any work overseas, in some of the most poverty-stricken countries in the world, they'll often bring back videos and pictures of their time there. And you'll look at people who were in situations that we consider extreme poverty, and yet everyone is smiling. Everyone is content with where they are in life. And you look around this country where we have been lavished upon by wealth, and so many people are discontent. According to some polls, it's more than it ever has been. 14% of American adults say they're content, which is down from 31% who said the same thing in 2018. So in 2018, 31% of people said they were content, and that's down almost half. In 2018, 23% they said they had often or sometimes felt isolated. That's now 50%. See, the number of people that is growing in this category, this group, it's unsurprising. Now, this information was gathered from the COVID response tracking study conducted by the NORC at the University of Chicago. But this survey was conducted in late May, and it draws only nearly half of the century of data taken by the General Social Survey, which was collected on the American attitudes and behaviors at least every other year since 1972. And so this is relatively new and accurate data that's been collected. But no less than 29% of Americans have ever called themselves very happy in a survey. 29%. When asked why, because that's kind of a low number if you think about it, a lot of the answers were things like this, like, well, it's just been one thing after another. How many of you can relate to the one thing after another syndrome? It feels like my whole adult life is like my wife and I saying to each other, well, once we get through this, everything ought to calm down a little bit. You ever feel like that? I feel like I say that all the time. Well, once we get through this and everything ought to calm down. It never calms down. It just keeps coming. But people are feeling that. We certainly are. I mean, we don't have to look very far to recognize the economy that we're in and what that means and what it looks like. People also said, you know, it's just really hard. It's just really hard right now. The thing stated the most in these surveys was, well, I just don't know what's going to happen next. And so there's an uncertainty among people. Well, they're looking for something stable. They're looking for something to anchor to, but they just can't quite find it. And so obviously, since the pandemic, these things are even more true and maybe even hyper-focused. The public is less optimistic today about the standard of living and improving for the next generation. Only 42% of Americans believe that when their children reach their age, their standing of living will be better. That's less than half. Less than half of us, and I'm one of those. I don't think that the standard of living for my kids is going to be better than it was for me. It doesn't seem to be headed that way. A solid 57% said that in 2018, and since the question was asked in 1994, the previous low was 45%. And so it's growing. And these aren't good numbers. These aren't healthy numbers. Twice as many Americans report being lonely today as in 2018. Think about that for a second. I mentioned social media. And the whole purpose of social media was really designed to connect people. And in some ways it has. Like I said, Byron and I wouldn't know each other if not for social media. We lived a mile from each other for 10 years and didn't know each other. We went to two different congregations, had no idea we even existed. And so there's an aspect in which social media can bring people together, but in a time where there's so much, how could this be true? That twice as many Americans report being lonely as they did just 5 years ago. And the truth is, you can be in a room full of people and still feel lonely. Proximity to other human beings doesn't solve the problem of loneliness. Connection does that. Maybe you can see where I'm headed with this, but that's where the church comes into play. Or that's where it should. I can tell you there were times, I've visited a lot of congregations all over the country where I just happened to be traveling through and this was the place on the way to where our stop was. And there have been congregations where we were so warmly welcomed, I could have moved there. The people were so nice and so friendly and so welcoming. Even invited me to participate in the service and to help, and it was wonderful. There's also been congregations I've gone to where no one even acknowledged we were there. We have a responsibility to the world that if someone walks in here off the street, much like I did, no matter what they look like, no matter their piercings, no matter their hair, no matter their tattoos, we have a responsibility to address that. That you should never feel lonely here. And that doesn't just go for members off the street. That goes for members of the congregation. No one here should feel lonely. This shouldn't be happening. Compared with 2018, Americans are also twice as likely to say they sometimes or often have felt a lack of companionship or left out. So it's isolation. It's disconnection. It's inflation. It's uncertainty. It's stress. Emotional, financial, chemical stress. It's alcohol. It's drugs. It's loneliness. It's all these things that are happening in the world around us. And this is why the world at large looks for something to care about. Because one other statistic that I wasn't able to fit on the screen is that since 2018, where all these things seem to be rising, loneliness and stress and anxiety, you know what else has risen? Almost double since 2018? Atheism. You think there's a connection there? Human beings were designed with an innate desire to worship. And the thing is we will worship something. Trust me, as a former atheist, I can tell you I worshiped plenty of things. I just didn't worship the God of heaven. Trust me, human beings will find something to worship. When life creates a vacuum, it will get filled with something. And that's where sowing decency comes into play. In an age where we're able to be connected more with the world than ever, yet we feel more lonely and we feel more isolated and more stressed than ever before. Maybe it's because we weren't meant to know everything in real time. Why are there 24-hour news networks? You know, when I was a kid, the news came on at 7 and 11. And now, it runs 24 hours a day, keeping you up to date on whatever's going on in the world. But I don't think we were designed to know what's going on the other side of the world at 2 in the morning. I don't think we were designed to know that. When I was a kid, I can remember things happening in other states or other parts of the world, and I would hear about it the next day, after they'd have time to collect information and verify facts. Now it's just about being first. Coming to you live from the situation, and we don't really know what's going on, but it's crazy, and it's just about being first. It's not about being right. Panic sets in. Anxiety shoots up. Narratives begin to swirl around, and before you know it, people are choosing sides on some event that has no effect on your life whatsoever. I don't think we were designed to know what's going on all the time, everywhere. I think only God should be allowed to do that. And I think we're seeing the cost of trying to do that now. We're constantly chasing happiness and contentment and fulfillment with things that ultimately will leave us empty. And so my one and only point for this lesson will be from this passage. A passage I know we know. This is not anything new. I'm not breaking ground here. But notice a couple things Paul says, and pick up the theme of how he works into the theme of sowing decency with some of the things that he says here. Follow with me. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but I have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all the mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I'm nothing. That's one to underline in your Bible. Circle it, highlight it, point arrows at it, whatever. That's an important passage. That if I have all powers, understand all the mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but I have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. It does not boast or envy. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but it rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, and hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, and I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. And now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I've been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. When we read this passage, it is usually with the intent to see the definition and the nature of what love is. What it means to love as we're supposed to love and as God has prescribed it. And that's still a correct approach, but I'll suggest to you there's something more here than just the definition and the nature of love. Here also lies the cure for discontentment. Here also lies the opportunity to sow decency, the recipe for properly sowing the seeds in the kingdom. Because our behavior is not simply the things we abstain from, but the fruit that we bear in our works. I'll never forget when I first moved to Fultondale, my first adult Bible class, I asked the class if they could tell me, if someone asked them what the Church of Christ was about, how would they describe us? I stood there for a good 60 seconds in silence. And I had to resist the urge not to say something, because that's what we always want to do. When it's quiet, you want to say something to break up that silence. But I said nothing. I wanted them to dig deep and tell me how you would describe us to the world out there. And finally a hand goes up. Well, we don't drink or do drugs. I'm like, okay, good. We abstain from drinking and drugs. What else? We don't sing with instruments. Okay. We don't sing with instruments. What else? Well, we don't let our kids go to the prom. Okay. We don't wear bikinis. Okay. We don't do anything in the Bible that's not authorized. Okay. And this goes on for another minute or so. But by the end of it, I've got a list of about 25 things that we don't do. And I said, this is great. These are all things that we should abstain from. You still haven't told me who we are. You've only told me who we're not. Is that who we are? Are we the church of the do nots? Are we the church of the thou shalt nots? There are a lot more thou shalls, and thou should, and thou must, than there are thou shalt nots. And if we get our theology and we base our approach on the things that we only abstain from, we are missing so much here. We're missing everything. It's not about just the things that we abstain from. It's also about the things that we do. Our behavior is not simply the things we abstain from, but the fruit that we bear in our works. You'll never have enough. And this is the thing that we want the world to understand. You'll never have enough of these things in the world that you're trying to fill this God-sized hole in your heart with. You'll never have enough of those things if there's no purpose in your life. And that's what Paul gives us here, is purpose. Purpose will never be found or attained through stuff or immoral behavior or drinking or drugs or money or vacations or anything else that we chase, pursuing fulfillment. If there's no purpose in life, no amount of what life has to offer will be enough. And what Paul gives us here are three simple concepts that make one point. And the first thing that he gives us here is faith. Faith is a lifelong work of the Christian. It's not something you have one time or something you did one time. It's something you do every day. That goes back to our quote from Tom Bodette. That for a man to be content, he must have something to do. And this is something we do all of our lives. It is work. It is something we choose to possess based on the word that we've heard and believed, which is something that we do. But it's much more than belief. James tells us that faith is not faith unless it's coupled with action. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? I'll suggest to you there might be some in the church that say yes. And I want to assure you, brethren, if you could do enough, if you could work enough, then you wouldn't need Jesus. And the fact is that we all do. And James says, can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed, lacking in daily food, and one of you says, go in peace and be warm and filled, without giving him the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now don't misunderstand me. These are things we should be doing. Those are the works produced by a faith that's changed while you're doing them. And what seems to be missing from so many currently that cannot attain contentment is hands that are busy. When hands are busy doing good works, so is the mind, which then leaves little time for an idle mind, which always gives Satan a playground that ultimately converts to a battleground. And so an active faith gives us plenty to do on the way to contentment, and it is the core factor of decency, of the morality that we have. If faith wasn't at the core of decency, then why change what we're doing? Why change? Why not just keep on? Have you ever noticed that when Paul talks about morality and he gives us the list, Paul loves lists. He gives us the works of the flesh and the things that will keep you out of heaven. He's not writing those letters to unsaved people. That's why I'm saying you can't take that, you can't use that as your evangelism tool. Because if you go and tell the world, hey, you got to quit doing these things, they're going to be like, no, I don't. Because they have no reason to change. Paul wrote those letters when he said abstain from sexual morality, when he said abstain from homosexuality, when he said abstain from drinking, abstain from lying, abstain from stealing, abstain from idolatry. When he said all those things in 1 Corinthians 6 and Galatians 5 and other places, he's talking to people who are already saved. He's talking to people who already believe. He's talking to people who have already changed their why, but they're still struggling. And faith then becomes the core for maintaining an anchor in that change. That I'm doing what I'm doing because I believe it's the right thing to do. Not because it's going to gain me special interest. I think sometimes we think the more we do, the more God's going to love us, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. God's never going to love you more than he already does. John 3:16. An overly used and abused passage, I know, but true nonetheless. For God so loved the world. Have you ever so loved something? It's a little more than just loving it, isn't it? When you so love something, it is all in love. It is all consuming love. It is all that stays in your mind and your heart and your eyes. It is a consuming love. To so love something would also require the ultimate sacrifice in providing for that thing. You see how that changes why I might do something or why I might not do something? And an act of faith then gives us plenty to do. It gives us plenty to think about. And followed right behind that, Paul gives us hope. That when we hope, we experience the feeling of expectation for something that is yet to happen. And it is hope that helps us focus and define our purpose as it works hand in hand with faith. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for. You see how those two things work together and they're connected? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It is in hope that we find strength to remain faithful when everything else is telling us not to. This is when decency has its moment to shine. It is the sustenance that the heart longs for. The thing that keeps our hearts content when the world is trying so hard to break them. At every turn, from the moment we wake up until the moment we close our eyes, Satan is trying to break your heart. He is looking for ways to hurt you, because if he can take your hope, he can take your faith. And so in some contexts, I believe hope is even greater or more important. And as a matter of fact, except for 1 Corinthians 13, every time faith, hope, and love are mentioned, the emphasis is always on hope and not love. And I think that's because while we're here, hope is all we got. Hope is all we got. How can we get through the day, much less this life, if we don't have it? I don't know who said this, but they said you can live about 30 days without food and about 15 days without water. You can live about 7 minutes without air. You can't live 1 second without hope. And I believe that's true. Hope, the conviction of things not seen, is something that I am mentally looking forward to, that I am spiritually and emotionally hanging on to. It gives us something beyond ourselves to live for. And in a world where discontentment and loneliness are a breeding ground for indecency and the work of the flesh, hope can be the one seed of decency that can turn everything around for the lost and the hopeless. Being a beacon for the light of the gospel in a dark world just might be the greatest act of decency there is. To understand that I am nothing special. And that none of us are anything special. We're all just beggars trying to show other beggars where to find some crumbs. But that's what sowing decency is all about. We know where to find the crumbs. And we can point others to it. And it is hope that gets them there. Which finally brings me to what Paul said is the greatest. And that's love. If faith gives us something to do, and hope gives us something to look forward to, then love is the glue that turns faith and hope into purpose. You see, love, while is a very simple idea, it is a complex and intricate engine that human beings run on. And while, make no mistake, love is all the feelings that we can express without words and actions, it is more so the words that we can't express. That idea of so loving something I was talking about earlier, it's a love that you almost can't even verbalize. And you know what I'm talking about if you have kids. From the moment they're born, really from the moment you know they're coming, you can't even verbalize what it is that you feel. You just know you feel it. And it's a feeling that would give you the strength to step in front of a bus to protect them if you had to. It's the strength that would give you the courage to fall on a sword if that's what it took to save their life. That there's nothing you wouldn't do to save them. And I think that's why John describes it the way that he does in 1 John 4. That we know love because God first loved us. And God gives us that model in giving us the ability to have our own kids. That from the moment I knew my kids were coming, I loved them more than I could express. And what do? We set aside a space for them in the house. And we bought things. A crib, changing table, 6,000 diapers to get us through the first 2 weeks. Make plans. You have hopes. All these things, man. That's God. God did the same thing for us. From the moment that He knew we were coming, He gave us a place. And He gave us stuff. And yes, in a very real way, He gave us spiritual diapers because we keep making messes. That He's more than willing to clean up. And so we understand what that means then. We understand that concept of loving something more than you could adequately express. And so when John says, quoting Jesus in his gospel, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you will love one another just as I've loved you. You also are to love one another. And by this all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." Notice that he says all people. Who exactly does all leave out? No one. And the idea is that we're to live in a way, not just by our words, but by our deeds, that people know who we belong to. No one should ever be surprised to find out that we're Christians. No one should ever be surprised to find out that you're a Christian. If they meet you and they go, I didn't know you were a Christian. It's time to reevaluate some things. Because if they didn't know that, then what have we been sowing? Because it's not decency. This is how Jesus said the world would know us. This is how the world will come to him. He told his disciples, and known as and you were light, a light set on a hill. And the idea is that the world will see us and they'll want to know what it is that we have. And it's not because we're doing this. It's because we're doing these good works. We're sowing these seeds of decency. We're loving the unloved. We're being long-suffering with the addicts. Man, I can't tell you how patient people were with me. I became a Christian November the 12th. It's coming up. 2001. I was 28 years old. You know when I got sober? November the 5th, 2006. I wanted to get sober in 2001. I wasn't sober till 2006. See, there's a process of getting sober. And I think sometimes we think in our minds, well, you're a Christian now, you should just stop. You know how brakes work in a car? If I'm going 120 and I just all of a sudden slam on my brakes, what's going to happen? I'm going to wreck and I'm going to hurt a lot of people. But if I begin applying the brake and I begin slowing down in a controlled way, I'm eventually going to come to a stop. In the meantime, the passengers in my car need to be long-suffering. We need to be long-suffering. We need to give hope to the hopeless. We need to help the faithless find faith, and we do that by loving one another. That's how we do that. It is the ultimate motivator for all that is decent and all that is good and all that is right. It is the reason that a husband and a father will get up at the crack of dawn and go do battle with the world to provide for his family. It is the reason that a mother will endure sleepless nights caring for a sick child that sometimes single-handedly holds the fort down while the father is away providing for his family. It is the reason that if it came down to a question of whether I die so that my family lives, there is no question to be had because love demands it. When we have someone to love, we have something to have faith in and something to hope for, and we then have the proper motivation for doing good works, for sowing seeds of decency and loving our fellow man through it all. Though none of this is about loving another human being as much as it is about loving Jesus. Because he is who we have faith in, he is who we hope to be with, and he is the author of the love that fuels the first two and that gives us purpose. And so contentment isn't going to be found in the world. It's not going to be found in stuff or trips or other people. It won't be found in gratifying the flesh and its desires and sin. There will never be enough of any of those to make that so. Contentment is found in purpose, the purpose that's created by faith, hope, and love. And sowing the seeds of decency is the fruit born by this life-changing exchange. And if it's true for the individual, everything that I've talked about so far tonight has been true for the individual. How much more for the church? If all of us individually did this, how powerful would that be just in your own life? You know, they say if you can't change the world, you can change your own, right? The world's a big place. And I can't convert a whole culture to Christianity, but I can convert one person. And so just think if each one of us did this individually. But if each of us are doing it collectively as individuals, what can be done? What sort of seeds could be sown? What sort of effect could we have on a community, on a city, a state, a country? If a church won't decide to love the Lord and their neighbors and their enemies, if a church won't hope for growth and change and rebuilding, if we do not have faith in God for the increase and for the pruning that comes with that, for the struggle, and only have faith whenever we get what we want, well, then we're just the clanging cymbals and gongs that Paul was talking about. Noise with no purpose. But that's not what we were designed to be, and that's not the purpose we were given. We were given the purpose of sowing decency in the world. And we do that by loving our brothers and sisters, giving the world something to hope for, and sharing our faith that we have in God with them. That's how we change a world, one person at a time. Each one teach one. And it begins with each one of us, ourselves. So we have something to do. We have something to look forward to. And there's a whole room full of people here to love. Satan comes to kill and destroy, to isolate. Jesus gives life. And he gives life more abundant. And when filled with faith, hope, and love, you'll find your purpose. You won't have time for Satan. With disconnection and anxiety and loneliness on the rise, look around this room. Look at one another and see the solution to that problem. It's all right here. It's all within us and what we've been given to do. Jesus gave us the church not just for him, but for us. That no one here should feel hopeless. No one here should feel lonely. No one here should feel unloved. And certainly, then, if we can have that feeling here, we can take that out there. There's plenty of decency here to be sown. And so I hope that we'll get busy. And tonight, if you're feeling hopeless or lonely or unloved, you know now that there's a purpose in being a Christian and part of the body of Christ. And you can be part of that right now. And I don't know everyone here. I know more people here than I thought. But I don't know what's going on in your life. I have no idea what's going on in your life. But you do. And so I want to encourage you that if you need help, if you need prayers, if you need to talk, that you'll let it be known and that you won't sit there. I think so often we sit in silence, wrestling with whatever it is, and we don't take advantage of the opportunity that you have here with so many in this room. James 5:16 says, the confession of our sins one to another gives us opportunity then to pray for one another. And the prayer of a righteous man avails much. If one man can avail much in his prayer, how much? 60 or 70 of us. Why would we miss that opportunity? If you need prayers, I'm going to beg you to let it be known tonight. Don't sit there. Don't sit there. And if you need to come to Christ and change your life, I'm going to beg you to make that change tonight. You can die with Christ in baptism, and you can start fresh and get busy with the purpose of sowing decency. If there's a need that you have, I'm going to beg you one more time, because God won't, but I will. So let it be known while we sing a song to encourage you.